Hey everyone, it's Peter Kerr from Daydream Nation, and I've got some special guests to this show. We are going to do a show on our favorite Beatles and solo Beatles albums. We're going to pick our 10 favorites. Bicyclelegs from the Bicyclelegs channel. How are you, my friend?
Yeah, always a pleasure, Peter.
And Todd Evans from the Contrarians, Grant Rock Warehouse, My Music Corner, etc., etc. How are you, Todd?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me on this. Always a pleasure, of course.
Not a problem. So, 10 to 1, I'll throw it to you, Bicyclelegs. What is your number 10?
Okay. Well, my number 10, if we'd done this 2 or 3 years ago, this would probably have been in my top five. So it's one that's been a little bit on the slide. It's a solo album. It's one that I probably, again, 2 or 3 years ago, I probably would have told you this is the best Beatles solo album ever released. I still love this album a lot, but it's just gone down a little bit in my estimation over the last couple of years. And that is John Lennon Plastic Ono Band from 1970. I love the rawness of this album. I mean, both emotionally and musically. It's wonderful. It's just a couple of other Beatles solo albums have kind of crept up in my estimation. Not so much this one falling down as it is other ones creeping up. So, yeah, that's my number 10 is John Lennon Plastic Ono Band. It's a cracking album.
Nice start to the show, Bicyclelegs. Todd, what's your number 10?
My number 10 is, and I had a little trouble with this one because there were a couple of other albums that were contenders for number 10. But my number 10 is Help. And I really feel like Help, a lot of people say, and I used to believe that you can see the Beatles changing direction during Rubber Soul. But I actually think it starts here. I think it starts here with You Got to Love Your Hide Your Love Away, and I've Just Seen a Face, and Yesterday, I think, is where you start seeing the shift. But yeah, I decided on Help. It was almost Beatles for Sale because I love I'll Follow the Sun so much, but the covers sort of pushed that out of the number 10 spot. And it was almost, and this is controversial, it was almost this because I love this. And a lot of people don't like the fact that Michael Jackson is on it, but I think this is a brilliant album and a lot of fun. But I pushed Help up to number 10 spot.
No problem. And we might do some honorable further mentions,
Okay.
at the end of the show, just throw a couple that just missed out. So,
Yeah.
yeah, no, nice start. All right, well, I'm going to start with my number 10. It's by John Lennon and Yoko Ono. It's Double Fantasy. Maybe a little bit controversial. To me, I think this is John Lennon, whose songwriting is kind of simplified, it's pure, it's heartfelt and direct. I have a lot of emotional attachment with this album, maybe because of the death of John Lennon in that year, but there are so many songs on this album that I just think are just wonderful pieces of music. I loved watching the wheels go round, Woman. I even like the Yoko Ono songs like Kiss Kiss, Beautiful Boy, Woman, Every Man Has a Woman Who Loves Him. Both sides of the coin, it's some of the most heartfelt songwriting from both John Lennon and Yoko Ono. And maybe the events of 1980 has made it more melancholy for me. Yeah, just like Starting Over, that song, I don't know. It almost makes me a little bit teary because there's just so much. I don't know if it's the chordal changes or the arrangement, but it just makes me kind of sad. Out of the whole Beatles discography, I think John Lennon, that particular album with Yoko Ono, is the one that I have the most emotional attachment, more so than the early 70s. So this might be a controversial start, but it is what it is, and that's my number 10, Double Fantasy.
Yeah, no, I mean, if any other John Lennon album was going to have made my top 10, that would have been the one. So,
Same here.
um, it's very conversational, the John songs, the Yoko songs. It's almost like they're having a conversation on the album. I love that about that record. It's a great album, no doubt.
Yeah, I think the earlier albums sort of lost me a little bit because they're very much in his primal scream phase. He's talking about a lot of his childhood. He's not reconciling about, his relationship with his mother. There's a lot of things that are going, but to me, I find this a little bit, I don't know, more emotionally sincere. It's more simple. It's more direct. It's more commercial. You've got a crack band behind it. But the things that I gravitate to this album is the Yoko stuff. In the day, I didn't like it. And a lot of people used to think it jarred because, oh, okay, you're just waiting for the John Lennon song to come on. But I think the Yoko songs have actually aged really well. And I tell you what, Yoko Ono has influenced so much rock, alternative, riot girl music. She has a bigger influence on alternative or music than a lot of people give her credit for. And this album, I just think her songs are just sublime. So anyway, I think it's a perfect match.
There are some of the John songs that I don't like because I'm not crazy about the production on them. But I have sometimes said that that's like half of a good album, and people assume that I mean that I like the Lennon half, but I don't like the Yoko Ono half, and I'm like, oh no, that's not it. That's not it. I like about half of the John songs and about half of the Yoko songs pretty much equally. But yeah, I like that album a lot. I just feel like there's a couple of production choices that I would wish that were different. But
yeah, it's slick. It's got a New York sound. I've always it's got a kind of that New York groove, that New York jazz sort of sound to it, that production. Jack Douglas did the production, so you know what you're going to expect from that. But
I think it was an indicator that I would have really loved his albums had he made some more.
I don't know. Is it the timing and all the events of 1980 that got caught up? But just emotionally to me, I just think if I go into the record collection and I pull out a John Lennon record, I always pull that out. Above, Imagine or Mind Games or anything, I always just go to this one. So, Bicyclelegs, number 9.
Okay. My number 9 is probably going to be the controversial one for me from my selections anyway. But I love this album. I have since it came out. And it is Tug of War from 1982. There's only one song on this album that I'm not a big fan of, and I think everybody knows which one it's going to be. It's Ebony and Ivory. It's a little bit saccharine. But the rest of this album, it's his reunion with George Martin. Ringo's on this album. But most importantly, Paul's songwriting is just stellar on this album. Things like Tug of War, Take It Away, his beautiful tribute to John, Here Today. Love that song. Ballroom Dancing, lots and lots of fun. The Pound is Sinking, Wanderlust. There's just so much good music on this album. And I don't think it has a particularly dated production because it's George Martin handling it. It's not some sort of slick new 80s producer. I just think it's one of my absolute favorite Paul albums. Love it to death. So that's my number 9. It's Tug of War.
That's really high up for me too. And I like Pipes of Peace over it because I think Pipes of Peace is a more consistent record, but Take It Away is a masterpiece. And I actually think that we would all think better of Ebony and Ivory had it not been like a monster hit and we'd heard it first. I think if that was just the last song on the album, it would go down better. But
no, I think it's a stinker.
That's just a hypothesis
I really don't like that song at all. I
okay,
think it's
for me
mortgage. I appreciate that, Todd. One thing, Todd and I have had a chat about Macca and how people are reappraising those 70s albums and Wings. And I think Wings over time has been elevated and a lot of people are realizing, that part of the catalogue is completely stellar. But the 80s, I still think there's a stigma. And over time, people will come and to realize that he did some fantastic stuff in the 80s.
Yep.
And that's a testament, Bicyclelegs, with that album. I think, over time, people will come to see how good those 80s albums were.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I really am sorry that he got so much heat from critics about doing too many ballads because that always really kind of made me angry. And I would be like, just keep quiet and let him do what he wants to do, because I think he's really good at that kind of stuff. And I wish he had done more of that.
So people have caught up with Wings. Maybe in a decade or so, they'll catch up with Macca in the 80s for sure. So,
I hope
wonderful. So. Todd, what's your next pick? Number
All
9.
right. Well, my number 9 is All Things Must Pass, which Peter and I have chatted about recently. And I was not very familiar with this record. When I was a kid, it came out in 1970, I was 6. But when I was of record buying age, which for me was like 9 or 10 or 11, I looked at this and thought, no, I'm not interested in that. So I never, it comes in a box. It looks like a classical record. It doesn't look very uplifting from the cover, but it is a really perfect slice of early 1970. It sounds like everybody's having a good time making it, and from most accounts, they were. The material is really strong, and the playing is really great. The engineering is, not up to everyone's taste, but I think that the material is super strong, and it was a very slow burn for me. I started out thinking, well, this is okay, and then the more I listened to it, I liked it more and more and more, and it got to the point where it made my top 10. So there you go.
Well, I'm surprised. So, kudos to you, and I'm glad that you got onto the George Harrison album, and great music. Over time, the penny does drop. Maybe it takes a few listens. And I think a lot of this Beatles catalog or Beatles solo is rewarding. It takes multiple listens. So fantastic. That's great. Band on the Run, Paul McCartney, number 9. It was monster hit. I'm sure that some of you folk on this panel may be talking about it, so I'll leave it to you to go maybe into intricacies, but this is a Paul McCartney songwriting masterclass. I think it's wonderful, and he copped a lot of heat in the early part of the 70s because I think anything that he was doing, they were comparing to the Beatles. The critics weren't really warm to Ram, or even, those first couple of solo albums. Could not be denied that he sort of had his symphonic multi-arrangement hat on. I mean, a lot of this reminds me of side 2 of Abbey Road, where he's doing these little suites and he's got the full sort of orchestral arrangements, really intricate. Jet, Let Me Roll It, Picasso's Last Words. I just think it's a wonderful album. And read the backstory, folks, about the adversity and when they were recording it in Nigeria. I tell you what, there's a whole movie and subplot to this. But no, I think this is like Paul McCartney in the 70s at his absolute stone cold peak with the songwriting, the arrangements, the musicianship. It sold a ton of copies.
Yeah.
It's almost like they were trying to sabotage it while they were making it. It's like they made a decision. Let's make this as difficult to do as possible.
Well, they say out of adversity, great art can emanate, and this certainly did occur. But I love everything about it. I even love, and I'll put the insert on this show, the album cover where they're all on the spotlight, and it's the who's who. I think you've got Christopher Lee, Michael Parkinson, and a few other personalities. I just love everything about the package of this album. But, and it was also, it's one of those albums where there are a couple of songs that are just built for radio. There's no way, shape, or form it wasn't going to get played to death on classic or AM radio.
Yeah.
All right, Bicyclelegs, number 8.
Well, before we get to number 8, I'll quickly say, if this had been a top 11 instead of a top 10, Band on the Run would have been number 11 for me. So,
I would, if I was a betting man, I would have sworn that you would have put this in top 10. You have surprised me.
Well, there you go. My number 8 is one that Peter and I have been talking about a little bit offline as to whether this should even be included or not. It's official Beatles canon, so it gets included. Magical Mystery Tour from 1967. This includes my single favorite Beatles song of all time, which is Strawberry Fields Forever. But the Magical Mystery Tour, it was released as an EP in the UK and here in Australia, actually a double EP. Um, I love all those songs. I love Flying, the instrumental. I love Fool on the Hill. The title track, Magical Mystery Tour, is great. This is the height of their psychedelia. It really is. You've got the wonderful Penny Lane. You've got Baby You're a Rich Man with one of the earliest sort of synthesizer sounds on it ever. Um, it's a great album top to bottom, and it's just a testament to what we're going to be looking at later on, that this is only number 8, because it's just a fantastic album. Love it to bits.
You're surprising me, I tell you what. I've got it in my head what your top 10 is, and it's just
Yeah.
completely out of whack. So I don't.
Well, there you go.
I actually did message Todd and put a little rider, and you can include Magical Mystery Tour. So I don't know. We'll wait and see. Todd, what's your next pick?
All right. Well, my number 8 is Rubber Soul. And, there was a time probably when I wouldn't have put this in a top 10. It would have been close. But I've really come to love it in the past 4 or 5 years. And I think that I don't want to give away any spoilers to what might be coming up later in my list, but as a transitional Beatles album goes, it's thinking of Sergeant Pepper's, when they really turned the corner in becoming more experimental. I think that this is a really strong album, and I'm holding up CDs because 2009 stereo remasters is where my heart lies. Those are my favorite versions of everything. So I just figured it'd be easier to hold up CDs. But I've got the mono box set. I've got American Capitol versions. I've got UK versions. But these are my favorite. And this particular reissue campaign is where I really became to start doing deep dives into these records. And so Rubber Soul is my number 8.
Oh, you can never have enough Beatles. I'm drowning in Beatles. I love it. And I think that's one of the top 3 Beatles album covers of all time. If we were doing
I think it's one
an
of the
album
top
cover
album
ranking,
covers of all time. Yeah, it's perfect.
It's just one of the best group photos. And when you looked at it, you thought, oh, they've changed. They've kind of gone a little bit darker, a little bit meaner, in a good sense. So
yeah, you say you can never have enough Beatles. I'm literally looking just across here where I've got a shelf, and there's about 10 Beatles box sets on that shelf. So
I've got all the 1987 Capitol CDs too. I've got it too much.
Oh yeah, there's never enough, and you always. And Facebook knows that I'm a Beatles sucker because, as soon as there's something that comes out, it comes up on my feed and I don't even ask for it. So it tells me. All right. My next pick is Revolver. So I think we've spoken about a lot of transitional albums to Sgt. Pepper or to their change in 67 to 70 because, 67 is always regarded as the year where the Beatles sort of went into a different phase. But I always think of this album as a dress rehearsal for Sgt. Pepper, and the songwriting is sublime. I mean, what superlatives can I mention for this album? I think Lennon and McCartney are still equal. And I've got this theory, and maybe a lot of folks may disagree with me, but I think that at the start of the Beatles, in the first half of their career, Lennon was the band leader, and he was the one that everything gravitated and revolved around him. But from 67 to 70, I think McCartney took over. And to me, I think this album is the last album where Lennon is still kind of right up there as an alpha male, toe-to-toe with McCartney. And I think from Sgt. Pepper's onwards that McCartney's he's the arranger. He's kind of the band leader. Hey, I might get a lot of heat for that, but that's just my opinion and that's just the way I feel. But the songwriting, Eleanor Rigby, Taxman, Dr. Robert, Tomorrow Never Knows, it's got that, some of the arrangements got that nice little Baroque feel to it. You still got that beat feel of a lot of their rock songs, which harks back to the 60s, but This, to me, is the dress rehearsal for Sergeant Pepper, and they're sort of saying goodbye and hello 1967 and Psychedelia. It's got a great album cover as well, which is wacky and psychedelic as all hell.
Yep.
Yeah, there's a lot to love on this album. But yeah, that's my pick.
Of course, that album cover done by their good friend Klaus Voormann, who would end up playing bass with John, George, and Ringo on various solo albums. So,
all right, Bicyclelegs.
all right, this one might be controversial in as much as that it's this low on the list. So, I suppose buckle up in the comments for this one, that this is only number 7, but here we go. Sergeant Pepper. I love this album to death, but there are a bunch of Beatles albums I like better than this one. I know it's a lot of people's favorite, but I mean, it's hard to argue with. There are so many great songs on here. The title track is wonderful. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. You know, there's so many classics that still get played on the radio. You know, Getting Better, Fixing a Hole, Day in the Life. You know, Day in the Life is possibly one of the most epic tracks they ever did. And it's a genuine collaboration between John and Paul, that song. Because, you know, it's John's verses and then Paul does this wonderful sort of little middle 8 section. And it was Paul's idea to have the big orchestral build up in the song and that sort of thing. So it's a wonderful album. I just like some of these other albums just a little bit better. So yeah, that's my number 7, Sergeant Pepper.
How many times have we said, oh, this is going to be a controversial take in this show? I think every single
I'm probably
take.
done saying that, but
yeah, it's going to become a cliche, folks, but that's all right. It's our take, so don't take things so personally. But I really appreciate that, Bicyclelegs. Tell me, do you think Paul was starting to pull away, starting to take a bit more control over the band?
I think he was definitely, you know, from Sergeant Pepper onwards, he was the driving force behind the band. I think John would concede in the early 70s that in this sort of period, he was getting a bit lazy. You know, he just wasn't one. And it was Paul who would always say, hey, boys, let's go into the studio. Let's record some songs, that sort of things. And especially just after this album, of course, Brian Epstein died. And, you know, very much Paul's kind of took over from Brian as being the driving force of the band. So, yeah, I think that's definitely a valid point to make.
Yeah, because I don't think John's musical palette was musical. I don't think John's musical palette was Baroque or horn arrangements or anything like that. I think he's a straightforward rock and roll type guy. And I don't know, Todd, what do you think? Do you think Paul was starting to pull away a little bit more on this?
Since you mentioned that you felt that about did you say that about Revolver? Is that right?
I think they were. I think Revolver. They were even Stevens. They were still alpha, but I think this album is when Paul's pulling away and he's being more of the driver of come on guys, and you know, in collaboration with George Martin, of course.
Well, one of the things that really bothers me about reading interviews with John Lennon is when he talks about, oh, that was one of Paul's grandma songs, or I don't remember what his exact words are, but there are front parlor songs or whatever he called them, and I'm like, hey, I like Maxwell Silverhammer. I like When I'm 64. And I think that Paul understood what he was doing. And I don't think that maybe John understood what he was doing. He was making the Beatles multi-generational. And I think that's part of Paul's genius. And I'm not really sure that John got that until later. So
yeah, Paul was a very sentimental guy, is a sentimental guy, and he likes to go back and reflect on the music that he listened to. So when I'm 64, I can imagine this is the sort of vaudeville, sort of the shows that he would have seen in Liverpool, or you know, the family hanging around the upright piano and playing sing-alongs. He wanted to bring that sort of music craft to the Beatles, but John, I think, was very just play rock and roll. You know, he didn't like the frills and he didn't like the baroqueness.
Well, that's, you know, a lot of people, a lot of folks will say you know, you're either a John guy or a Paul guy, and I won't do that. I don't want to pick a side. But whenever I see anything, any clickbaity thing on YouTube where they talk about the 10 songs John Lennon hates, they're always Paul's more nostalgic kind of songs, and I'm always like, oh, I love all those. So,
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I love them both. I don't put one in front of the other, but I
right.
can tell you when I look at those early clips of the Beatles, like Beatles for Sale or Help, my eyes are gravitating to John because he is the badass. He's the leader of the
Mhm.
band. But I just think that when they did less videos and they went into the album craft, it was Paul that was more of the driver, and as Bicyclelegs said, John became more laid back. I mean, Abbey Road, when you do it like song by song, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that album, or some of us will be. John is taking a very back seat.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think also, we talk about songs like When I'm 64 and Maxwell Silver Hammer and um, Honey Pie on the White Album. You know, what we've got to remember is that Paul's father, Jim, was a jazz musician. He was like a semi-professional jazz musician himself. So Paul would have grown up with a lot of that sort of, 20s, 30s, 40s kind of music because of his dad. So because his dad was, about 40 years old when he was born. So he was a bit older. So sort of brought that influence into Paul's music, I think, too.
It's a kind of a what if. What if Paul wasn't in the band and it was John? I think that a lot of this would have been much more straight and linear in regards to rock. I don't think the template would have been as big.
Maybe they would have been more like the Kinks or a band like that, where they would have not necessarily had like this turning point and became a different kind of band. Maybe that's not the
Yeah.
best example, but that's the best one I can think
No, no,
of.
no. That's good because Kinks were very observational. They did a lot of kitchen sink dramas. They did a
Hmm.
lot of storytelling. I think John and Paul were always in competition, so there was a lot of one-upmanship, and that created beautiful art. So Paul would come up with a cracker of a song, and John would probably go, "I've got to beat that." And I think Paul inspired John to go in and dig deep and be more social observational, be more do your storytelling. And that probably came out in a lot of the songs. Now, if Paul wasn't in that band, who knows, would have been just a little bit more straightforward.
Yeah, and I think some of the later period songs that you can just sort of tell are John's are stronger because of that, because he
Anyway,
felt like he's being pushed.
it's all speculation.
All right, so my number seven is Band on the Run, and I almost put this a little bit lower, but it's just so good. I mean, it really is. And this is another album that it took until I was always familiar with it and always had it, but it took until this reissue, which is when 2010, until I really dove into it. And it's just so strong. And they the way they made it was just so bizarre, deciding to go to Africa to do it and to be, to make it so difficult to go into a studio that really wasn't up to the standards and then try to make it all work and pull equipment in and everything. It's amazing. I that it came out as good as it did. And so this is my number seven, and it's controversial for me. I can use that word again because I've done a show where I picked my favorite Wings albums, and this was not number one. Back to the Egg was, which also almost made this list. So I'm kind of all over the place.
It just goes to show, folks, because it's a very fluid list, isn't it? Like, if we
Mm,
did
Yeah,
this show in a month's time, I'm sure our order or maybe some of the selections might change.
yeah.
yeah.
So, doing an album in Nigeria, they're lucky to come out alive, quite frankly.
Yeah.
They could have been the last stand of Paul McCartney and Wings, really.
And
There's
there
a
was a lot
movie.
of people there that resented them for coming there. And
Yeah.
it's just like, man, you guys made it so hard on yourselves. You could have just gone to a studio in London, but that's part of its charm, I think, is that all the adversity.
Absolutely. All right, my next pick is one that's gone up in my rankings, and it's the Let It Be soundtrack. So this came out in 1970. It's the last Beatles album, but technically it wasn't because a lot of the recordings were recorded before Abbey Road. So I think everyone's seen the movie or the documentary with Peter Jackson, and the actual original movie from 1970 has just recently got a re-release. I've had the bootleg for ages, but I will probably pick it up on Blu-ray and revisit it. I think this album is just a collection of beautiful songs. Some of them, the arrangements and the production, a lot of folk don't like The Long and Winding Road. Across the Universe has that Phil Spector sort of magic dust, or you may have a different opinion. But it's still got some wonderful songs like Get Back. It's like simple rock and roll, but it's so infectious, and it's just one of the Beatles, top tier rock songs. Let It Be, I've always loved that song. Maggie May, even the deep cuts, Two of Us. The one after 909, which was a Beatles song that Paul McCartney and Lennon wrote when they were young. And they've just wheeled it out, and it just sounds wonderful. It sounds like they're just sitting down and just reminiscing about the old times. So, look, I think this is an album where you've got all these different sort of songs. It creates one great album. That's my pick. Let It Be.
Yep.
Bicyclelegs.
Okay, my number 6 is going to be Ram from 1971. Paul and Linda McCartney. I mean, this album, I don't think this is a controversial pick at all, because I think this album in the last 5-10 years has really gone up in people's estimations. When it first came out, it was absolutely panned. But in the last several years, it really has undergone a critical reevaluation, and rightly so, because I think it's an incredible album. People probably, again, the song that probably maybe not as great as all the other ones in a lot of people's minds, although I really like it, is Uncle Albert, Admiral Halsey, because it's a bit whimsical, but I like it. It's got that kind of charm that Paul McCartney has. But you've got songs like Too Many People, Three Legs, Backseat of My Car, Monkberry Moon Delight. A lot of people are saying these days that this album invented indie rock or lo-fi, and I can kind of see that. But it's my favorite Paul McCartney album. So yeah, that's my number 6, Ram.
Well, there you go. Uncle Albert, I love that song. And
I think it's
album,
a masterpiece.
I think it is. Yeah, I think Todd and I have spoken about this, but it's I think it's one of my all-time favorite Paul McCartney singles. I actually had a actual single of it. I don't know. It's gone somewhere. It probably through the steps of time. But I love that. And I remember flipping it over, and It's Too Many People was on the B-side. That is a cracker of a single, A and B. Love it.
Yeah.
I remember Uncle Albert and Admiral Halsey being on the radio when I was 5 or 6 years old, and just sitting in the back seat of my dad's car on the way to Grandma's, just trying to process it. Like, what exactly is happening here? And that might be one of the reasons why I love it so much.
And there's a cheeky sense of humor all the way through it. That may be the whimsy side of it. I think I like it. That album, I think, is spot on. That would be between 11 and 20 if I was going to expand this list to the top 20 easily. Ram.
I think I like it a little less than you guys do. I'm just now warming up to it. I thought about including it, so it's like 12, 13, something like that. But I feel like the difference between like Uncle Albert, Admiral Halsey, and some of the stuff that's really homespun and like down on the farm I'm still grappling with that. trying to think of it as a cohesive whole.
Yeah.
But
But the
I
critics
realize that's part of its charm. So I'm getting there.
yeah. But the critics in the day, they absolutely panned this album.
Oh yeah, it got
Yeah, they could,
lambasted.
but over
I think it's
time,
way better than that.
but a lot of this criticism in the day is, I think there was a definite element that was turning against Paul McCartney. He could have put out the most brilliant albums, but it was Paul McCartney. Maybe
Well,
people were sort of blaming him for breaking up the Beatles. Maybe they were aligning, it was a Paul versus John thing, bias in this criticism that was kind of unfounded.
yeah. But at the same time, I mean, and this may be an unpopular opinion, but I feel like on McCartney and a little bit on Ram and on Wildlife that it kind of sounds like he's just goofing around at times. And it almost seems like, are you really spending Capital's money or EMI's money on this? So I think there might have been people that expected a certain level of not quality, but a certain level of polish that they weren't getting. And I wonder if sometimes if that's maybe why critics turned on him, is because they thought,
Bicyclelegs, what do you think of that one?
Yeah, I think that both of those things are quite valid. I think a lot of people don't realize in 1970 and 1971, people weren't blaming Yoko for breaking up the Beatles. They were blaming Paul because he was the one who came out with the statement when McCartney came out saying that the band was done and all that sort of thing. And I think that Paul was quite deliberately on those first two or three albums trying to scale things back, trying to bring it back down to earth from sort of
yeah,
that Abbey Road kind of gloss and polish. And I think people misinterpreted that and felt like he was being deliberately sort of third rate and that sort of thing. Whereas what he was actually doing was trying to be a little more down to earth, a little more homespun, as you said. And I think nowadays people are starting to realize that. McCartney has gone through this sort of critical reevaluation. Ram has. I think Wildlife will eventually. I did a show with Davey Gallagher on my channel where we defended Wings Wildlife. I love those albums, and I think they're definitely due for reevaluation.
Red Rose Speedway, that needs to be reevaluated as well. I think that whole 70s period needs to be reevaluated. But McCartney 1, I think, got a fair amount of praise in the day, but it was the subsequent ones after that. I think between McCartney and Band on the Run, there was this run of albums where he was very maligned.
Yeah.
Well, and on Red Rose Speedway, for me, that album kind of goes like this. And I think that you can hear the brilliance that's coming on that album. You catch a glimpse of it, and then Band on the Run comes out. So
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Todd, what's your next pick?
all right. Well, my number 6 is Let It Be. And there might have been a time when I might not have included Let It Be, but I'm very much a traditionalist with Beatles in that it's supposed to be produced by George Martin, so which is based on nothing but my own personal biases. But I have to say that I have reevaluated this in the last 10 years or so, and I love The Long and Winding Road. I don't care who knows it. I absolutely love it. And so take that, haters. And I just think Get Back is one of my favorite Beatles songs of all time. And I never get tired of it. I like it more and more as the years go on. So yeah, this is my number 6.
What do you think the Let It Be Naked?
I don't think it's better.
I agree.
I think it's interesting, but I don't prefer it over this.
Absolutely. And is it because that our entry point is that original album? It's just too jarring, too stripped back. You kind of miss the arrangements and all the bells and whistles.
I don't think there's anything wrong with the arrangements. I think they're fine. Yeah. I think if George Martin had done it, it might be a little better, but I like it how it is. It is what it, I mean, it's history. It is what it is.
Yeah. But no, it's an interesting part of their catalogue that they did the naked version, and I think Paul was he was pushing it. He was very much supportive because
I'm glad they did it.
Yeah, Paul wasn't a big fan of the Phil Spector. I think there was even a typed up letter that was circulating of him writing to Phil Spector, basically saying, you know, I do not approve this and blah blah blah. But anyway. All right, Bicyclelegs. This might be controversial. How it's a little bit low in the pecking order, but I'm going to pick the White Album. Flawed masterpiece, this album is. It is a double album. It's basically the Beatles solo. So they come back from India. They have a wealth of material. Boy, do these solo songs, they shine. Each of the Beatles, you know, Paul McCartney back in the USSR, John Lennon with Dear Prudence, George with While My Guitar Gently Weeps, even Ringo Starr, Don't Pass Me By. He's bringing his little bit of country into it. So everyone has a moment to shine. But there are some songs on this album that they're kind of a little bit filler. And no, I'm not a big fan of Revolution 9. I know it's a little bit avant-garde. When it gets to Revolution 9, I lift the needle and I do flick the album over. I don't want to go through that. There is a little bit of sort of schmaltz. Good Night, I'm not a big fan of. Rocky Raccoon, that's a little bit cheesy, but I forgive it because there's so much ambition, there's so much grandeur in this project, and it's, you know, basically it is a collection of 4 Beatles solo albums put into a double LP. It's just so wildly experimental and brave, and it's got some of their best songcraft. So the White Album, that's the pick for me. Bicyclelegs, you want to say something? Maybe.
No, I'll just more on that later.
More on that later.
Yeah. I'll go with my number 5, talking about big sprawling albums. All Things Must Pass, George Harrison. This is the Australian version. We didn't actually get it in a box originally. We got it as like
I would have preferred that.
like gatefold. So, I mean, I'm not going to talk too much about this album because you two fine gentlemen have just recently done a wonderful show on this album, which all of Peter's viewers, if you have not already gone and looked at their All Things Must Pass show, go and do yourself a favor and check it out because it's wonderful. But this album, I mean, it's just great. To me, I always think of this as a double album with a bonus disc. You know, and I would even argue that it's the world's first bonus disc. So, you know,
probably
George being innovative there. But I mean, all the songs on those first 4 sides are just absolutely wonderful. And to think that a lot of those got rejected by the Beatles is just mind-boggling to me because, you know, they're just incredible songs. I will also quickly say that one of my other favorite bands is Spock's Beard, and the very first Spock's Beard song I ever heard was their cover of Beware of Darkness. And I've got to say, it was not maybe the best entry point for me for Spock's Beard because I kind of raised one eyebrow because I bought that album just completely on spec, and I listened to Beware of Darkness and was like, and then a couple of some more songs in, I was converted to being a Spock's Beard fan. But
I didn't hear that version of Beware of Darkness until I had already had like 4 other Spock's Beard albums. So
yeah,
so luckily I didn't have that reaction.
But yeah, it's an incredible album. It's a gargantuan statement from George, just saying, hey, I've been here all this time with all these songs. It is, you know, possibly my favorite Beatles solo album. It's just an incredible statement to me. So yeah, that's my number 5, All Things Must Pass.
Here and well said. Got nothing more to say on that. Todd Evans, what's your number 5?
My number 5 is Revolver. And, you know, when I was younger, I thought that this was more different from Sgt. Pepper's than I think it is now. The older I get, the more I see it as being a little bit closer to that. But I think Tomorrow Never Knows is just stunning. And I mean, they're Here, There, and Everywhere is on this. Taxman, I think you get the first really strong George song, I think, in my opinion. And Definitely the UK version and not the US version, which leaves out too much good stuff. But yeah, Revolver, I mean, it seems like in the past 10 years or so that you'll meet a lot of people who might say that this is their favorite or they put it way, way, way up at the top. And I appreciate that, but this isn't, top four for me, but it is number five. So I don't think that's too bad.
Interesting you should say that. I think Mojo magazine about 10, 15 years ago had that as the number one album of all time, or Beatles
I've seen
album
a
at
couple of
least. Yeah.
places put it at number
Way
one.
up.
Yeah.
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 Interesting. Right, thank you. My number 5 is like Bicyclelegs, All Things Must Pass. I think this is just a masterpiece. Yeah, check out the show that I did with Todd. We go into detail and spotlight all the songs more or less. We cross over. I think the quiet moments on this album are just so beautiful and thoughtful and spiritual and lyrical. You know, this guy, it's just an explosion of ideas and creativity and artistry. It was just like he was holding it in. And then when he got free of the Beatles, it was like, and it all comes out. And he grabs his friends and they have a ball. I love the Phil Spector production. Don't love the man, but I love his production. I love his artistry on this. But look, I can't say enough how much I love this album. My Sweet Lord, Wah Wah, Isn't It a Pity? There's just so many great songs there. And see the documentary about the life of George Harrison, and a lot of it's wrapped around this, the Martin Scorsese documentary. A lot of it is centered around this particular album, and that's worth catching. So, All Things Must Pass is my number 5. Number 4, Bicyclelegs.
Number 4 for me. I think at this stage, these last few albums, I'm probably not going to have an awful lot to say about, just because everybody knows these albums and everybody knows all about them. My number 4 is Abbey Road. It's a great album. I'm with Todd. I like Maxwell Silverhammer. It's not my favorite song on the album, but I don't think it deserves the hate that it gets. But I mean, Come Together, Something, George really making a statement with Something, actually getting the A side of a single. Octopus's Garden, I think, is absolutely charming. I Want You, She's So Heavy is great. And the medley on side 2, incredible. It's just a great album, beginning to end. Just my top 3 I like a little bit better. So yeah, that's my number 4. It's Abbey Road.
Nice job. Todd, number 4.
My number 4 is legitimate album, Magical Mystery Tour. And I just think, as far as going from strong song to strong song, this album just really does that. And I will admit right now, and I know it's not a cool thing to admit, but The Fool on the Hill is my favorite Beatles song. I don't care who knows it. So file that along with me thinking that Long and Winding Road is great as well. But so many just incredible ideas and experimentations and different kinds of instrumentation happening on this album. And I know most of these songs were singles and all that stuff, but I think putting them together right here, I think that you really see that this is really one of their most creative times. So that's my number 4.
Very nice indeed. My number 4 is Rubber Soul. So I think this is probably the best of the early Beatles. It really finishes their beat period, the rock and roll period, and then you start to see a lot of the more Baroque songs, the more balladry, the more sense of arrangements. I don't know. This is a change album for me. You can tell by the cover, which we've discussed, and also just the lyricism. Yeah, I just love everything about it. So Drive My Car, What Goes On, Run for Your Life, If I Needed Somebody, Norwegian Wood, Nowhere Man. I just think, John and Paul are on an even keel. Even George Harrison is starting to find his voice, find his songwriting and chops in this album. But Rubber Soul, I think it's a game changer. And I think everything that happens in the Beatles' discography happens for a reason. You can see that there's progress from one to the one, because if there wasn't a Rubber Soul, there wouldn't be a Revolver. If there wasn't a Revolver, there wouldn't be a Sgt. Pepper. And this, to me, is just maybe a little bit of a finale of that opening period, and lays the foundations from later works. So Rubber Soul, that's my number 4. Number 3, Business End, Bicyclelegs.
Well, Peter, your number 4 is my number 3, Rubber Soul. To me, this is the first cohesive album they made, rather than just an album that was a collection of songs and potential singles. A few songs that haven't been mentioned that I want to talk about. I'm Looking Through You, I think, is one of Paul's finest sort of early period songs. And one thing I wanted to disagree with Todd about a little bit, he said that, George's first great song was Taxman on Revolver.
I figured I'd get some heat for that.
I absolutely love Think for Yourself and If I Needed Someone. I think they're both incredibly great songs, particularly Think for Yourself, with that wonderful fuzz bass from Paul, It's absolutely wonderful. So, yeah, that's mine. I won't say anything else about it because you two fine gentlemen have already said a lot about this album. So that's my number 3, Rubber Soul. Love it to bits.
Yeah, it's a great album. I've got so many versions of this album. I've got a few overseas, mono, stereo. I think my favorite version is the American version, where the cover is just so glossy, you can almost see your reflection. And sort of similar to your one, maybe you put it up, Bicyclelegs, that really shiny, see, you can see the reflection.
Yeah, it's a nice laminated cover, yeah.
Yeah. When they were starting to, records were starting to become art. I think Rubber Soul was the start of that. All right, Todd.
All right, well, my number 3 is the White Album, or the Beatles, sorry. I think that this album, even though, it's long and it has some songs that are really experimental, some people think too experimental, I think that some of their best songs are on here. There's a couple of rock songs that are really that are back in the USSR, and I mean, but Dear Prudence and Glass Onion for me are 2 of my favorite Beatles songs, and also Savoy Truffle I think is great and super underrated. I want to say though about Revolution 9, I think that Revolution 9 was one of those things that happened when you're growing up and you're getting, because I can remember when I was 14, 15 years old, it was like 1980. And so, this album is only 12 years old at that point. But Revolution 9 is one of those things that we loved it because it was so weird. And it was just one of those things that you get to discover. You get your big sister's or your uncle's record and you get this out and you're playing it and you're thinking it's great. And then you get to Revolution 9 and you're like, wow, what am I supposed to even do with this? And so for that reason, I think it's cool that it's there. And I have to say something in defense of Goodnight. I love Goodnight. I have seen people try to turn this into a single album and chop songs off of it and try to resequence it. And I'm like, if you chop Goodnight off, I don't have anything to say to you. So I think Goodnight is great. I love how eerie it is and how sad it sounds. I think it's the perfect end to something so weird as this album. And so that's my number 3.
Yeah, nice take, Todd. It's really funny. Like, we have different takes on the albums and what songs that we gravitate to more than others. But I think maybe, when I first listen, I can actually remember the first time I listened to this album and I saw Revolution 9. I thought, oh, it must be a rocking sequel to Revolution. Wrong. And
Right.
yeah, and some of the sound effects on that particular song actually scared me because I was
Yeah.
very
Oh,
much
sure.
when I was a teenager or a young ticker, I was very much a headphones guy. And that album, there's some in Revolution 9, there's some sound effects that are kind of disturbing. It goes from one
Yeah.
ear to the other, and so maybe it
And
was that angle that sort of is, stays with me to today.
And I
So
forgot to mention when I was in high school, when I was in like ninth and 10th grade, I was into progressive rock and I was into punk rock and new wave. And I was like one of those people, oh, the Beatles are overrated. I don't even know if I even like the Beatles. And then I heard this, and that's when I started to like, okay, I like the Beatles. The Beatles are cool, I suppose.
yeah, absolutely.
Man, what a dumb kid I was.
Weren't we all?
Yeah,
Yeah.
indeed. But yeah, over time things change, and that's
Yeah.
what it's all about. Magical Mystery Tour, legitimate album, love it. I think 1967 was my favourite year in Beatles. So I think they were at their absolutely stone cold creative peak. So maybe that's giving away some of my other alternative peaks. But I love this combination of two EPs. I think it's got the greatest Beatles single or double A side of all time with Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever. I don't think there's much, you can't find a better double A side. You couldn't put an A and B over those two. And you basically got McCartney and Lennon putting probably two of the greatest Beatles songs ever. I even like Bicyclelegs, you've spoken about this really eloquently, but I love the deep cuts on this album. I love Blue Jay Way. I love Baby You're a Rich Man. It's got so much groove to it. That's actually arguably maybe my third or fourth favourite song on this whole album. But yeah, I just like, it's such a strong album. There's not much more I can say. Hello, Goodbye. All You Need Is Love. What a great song. There's nothing really I don't like. I think it's all killer, no filler. So
Yeah.
Magical Mystery Tour.
I wanted to say something about 1967. If I'm not mistaken, and if I am, somebody correct me in the comments. 1967 is the year that the Moody Blues turned in from a bar band into a progressive rock band with Days of Future Past. And I think that was that year is kind of a turning point year. I think that's when albums stop being just 10 songs and they start being an artistic statement.
And listen to 1967, like what the Beatles were in 63 compared to 67. It's like their artistic ability, songcraft has accelerated at the rate of knots. I mean, they were together for a long time. Todd and I have spoken about that, but what they crammed into that period of time is just immeasurable. Magical Mystery Tour. And the walrus was Paul, apparently. Bicyclelegs.
Okay, you were wondering earlier whether I was going to do a mid-show switcheroo. Well, my number 2 and my number 1 are always switching places. And I had them in a particular order, and just 5-10 minutes ago, I switched them. So my number 2 today, and this could change tomorrow or even in an hour's time, is going to be Revolver. Love this album to death. You talk about all killer, no filler. And you talk about 1967 being a great year. 1966, this came out and Pet Sounds came out. I mean, two of the most incredibly, they really led the way into what 67 would be, I think, those two albums. But, again, I don't think there's much more I need to say about this because you two have both talked about a lot of these songs already. One thing I will say, She Said, She Said, great song. Love it. Closes out side one. I mean, Here, There, and Everywhere is one of Paul's finest ballads. Absolutely gorgeous. As is For No One. And Your Bird Can Sing, another really great sort of psychedelic song. Yeah, it's just a wonderful album from beginning to end. And fun fact, the most experimental song on this album is Tomorrow Never Knows. That was actually the first song they recorded for the album. I mean, what a way to start those sessions. Just incredible. Yeah, that's my number 2, Revolver.
Imagine if the Beatles never married up with George Martin, what their career would have been.
I don't think it would have been.
Yeah, he's definitely part of the story because he's, and he had the fortitude to see something in these guys that a lot of the other record labels and, producers didn't see in the Beatles. So I don't know. All right, Todd, number 2.
My number 2 is Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. I think that I don't even know what to say. I mean, the sequencing on side 1 especially, I just think is absolutely fantastic. I think that I think the record sounds beautiful. I've got like 5 different versions of it, and I think every single one of them just sounds absolutely amazing. I think A Day in the Life is just a groundbreaking song, and I feel like even the packaging is just, I mean, it's just so iconic. The colors, I mean, just this whole thing with the yellow and the red and all of this is just so the little thing that came in the record that you could like punch out or whatever that thing was. Just all of it is so iconic, and it just starts this whole new era in record covers as art and albums as pieces of art. And I think that it really starts here. I mean, they started it taking the steps towards this, the 2 albums or even the 3 albums before this, but I think this is the real game changer in rock music. So, and I think, like I said before, because of Paul's contributions, I think this is when they became truly multi-generational. And it's funny, I have one of my high school friends said that you were talking about Revolution 9 scaring you. And one of my high school friends said that he used to be frightened by being for the benefit of Mr. Kite because of the way the fade out is at the end with all the noises and stuff. And as soon as he said that, I mean, I was like in the 10th grade when he told me that. It's like when I was a kid, that song used to scare me. And ever since then, it scares me a little bit. It's like in sympathy, but it's spooky.
Yeah, there's a few spooky bits. I agree with you about Mr. Kite, that the sound effects and that really kind of scared me. And the in the inner groove with the crowd at the end of A Day of the Life, there's like this crowd noise. And if you had a repeat if you had a problem with your stylus, it might get stuck in the inner groove and make this sort of crowd noise. That was a bit frightening. So,
yeah, that's frightening too.
Yeah.
And one thing I will say about that album too is a lot of people will pick for their favorite George Harrison song, they will pick Something or Here Comes the Sun or While My Guitar Gently Weeps. My favorite George Harrison song during the Beatles is Within You Without You. I adore that track.
And another song that just, I mean, it hits you. I mean, and you're like, I don't think I've ever heard anything like that before. It's just one of those things that immediately makes you think, oh, that's challenging me. At least that's how I felt about it when I was a youngster. But
yeah, well said, Todd. All right, my number 2 is Abbey Road. So I think this is a masterpiece Beatles album. But my favourite song on the whole album, and I think this is top 5 Beatles, is Something. And for Frank Sinatra to say this is one of the great songs, love songs of the 20th century, says something. Because I bring up Frank because Frank never liked pop music or rock music. He thought they were bums. But for him to mention this song as being a masterpiece, and but I think Paul, as Bicyclelegs said it in the earlier pick, that little suite of that symphonic suite of songs at the end is just wonderful. Come together, it's a cracker of an opening track with John Lennon, even though it does crib a little of Chuck Berry, and he had to pay some residuals in the end. I don't mind Maxwell's Silver Hammer. I know that it's a little bit, it's sort of like goes into that music hall or vaudeville, but I accept that. Octopus's Garden is just one wonderful, whimsical. They still teach that song in preschool and primary school, you know. The melody, the arrangements, the breadth of experimentation, everything's just so wonderful on this album. And even the iconic photo, how many times has that been imitated? Something simple. What should we do today, lads? Okay, let's take a photo walking across the Abbey Road. And Paul, you're going barefoot. That's wonderful. I've got nothing much more to say. I think it's been said before, but Abbey Road, that's my number 2.
Yep.
Okay, Business End, Bicyclelegs.
All right.
The number one, drum roll.
It's the Beatles.
I thought it would be.
White vinyl, this one.
Nice.
The 1987 re-release. There was a white version of the White Album, there was a red version of Sgt. Pepper, and a yellow version of Yellow Submarine. I am going to be doing a show next month with Davey Cretan, our good friend, and it's going to be a friendly arguments show because he does not care for this album very much.
Oh.
So, whereas it's my favorite, well, it is today anyway. I adore this album. I will defend the bits that people don't like on this album. I love Revolution 9. I love it because it's scary as well as rather than in spite of the fact it's scary. I love some of the little bitty things like Wild Honey Pie. People say, oh, that's just a minute of rubbish, you know. I love it. I think it's a great little experimental bit that just, you know, sort of tags 2 songs in between. You know, things like the continuing story of Bungalow Bill and Long, 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 I think is one of George's most beautiful ballads. It's a haunting, haunting song. But I won't go into too much more detail on it because you guys have both talked about it. I love the fact that it's all in our top 10 because I don't think it's an album that always gets the respect it deserves. As Todd mentioned, you know, a lot of people try to cut this down to a single album, and I think, no, there's nothing I would get rid of on this album. Even the bits that most people think are sort of silly or rubbish or whatever, I love them. I think the flow of the album is perfect. Love it to bits. So, yeah, that's my number 1, is the White Album.
Nice pick.
Yeah, it's funny. It's like the little bits are what make it so great. And yeah. I think that it's why, I mean, imagine if the White Album had never been made. Nope. I mean, just think of all the double albums that came after. All of the albums that have little bits of nonsense kind of just stuck in the middle of them. It's brilliant.
Yeah, I agree with you, gentlemen. And even though there are some bits on the album that I don't like, I think it's got to be there. And I can tell you on this channel, Rock Daydream Nation, I'm never going to do one of those cliched hackney shows, double album that you can turn into a single album.
Right.
I'm so bored of those shows. If an artist has ambition to do a double album, let them do that.
Yeah.
Because you don't like it doesn't mean that, you know, you have to go down that path. So, no.
Yeah. And you know, another thing I wanted to say about it when I was talking about it is one of my favorite parts of that album, and I guess it's the end of side 2, I Will and Julia next to each other. And whenever anybody does one of those, let's make it into a single album, they cut one of those songs, I'm like, no.
No.
Yeah.
No, your argument has just now been made moot. They have to both be there and they have to be next to each other.
Yeah. No. I want to hear the full artistry. I want to hear the artist's vision. I may not dig all the songs, but as a whole, I think it's a brilliant album. And
it's one of the, you know, 10. I could be wrong. You know, maybe there's something before it, but it's one of those first albums that just made people try to make sense of it. You know what I mean? And that's what I loved the most about it. It was because it was the first time that a really popular mainstream band put out an album that was just like, well, here you go. Here's something really long. And there's going to be some subversive stuff in it. And you're just going to have to deal with it. Because that's just That's just what it is. And so I love that. I love it for that. You're probably wondering why I didn't pick it as number one.
Okay.
I love it so much.
Yeah. All right, Todd, what's your number one pick?
My number one is Abbey Road. I think that there's something for everybody on this album. If you like Paul's front parlor music or whatever John called it, it's, you got it on here. If you like raw rock, you've got I Want You, She's So Heavy. And I mean, the first time, I mean, we take it for granted now, but when you listen, sometimes when I hear Come Together and I listen to how that lead guitar is recorded with so up front in the mix and so loud with so much distortion. I mean, that must have been considered practically subversive at the time. But now you hear it and you just go, oh, okay, Come Together. But it really is something. I mean, and I never get tired of hearing it. And every time I hear it, I'm amazed at how cool it sounds and how it brought so it changed the landscape for so many people and so many other bands that were influenced by the sound of that song. But the suite is just fantastic, and it paved the way for so many of my other favorite albums, and especially in the art rock and prog rock genres. It's the quintessential version of that kind of thing. And whenever I hear somebody try to attempt something like it, whether it's Todd Rundgren or they might be Giants or whoever, I just think, man, if it weren't for Abbey Road.
Yep.
Yeah, well said, Todd. And I forgot to mention, like, She's So Heavy.
Yeah.
It's kind of a prototype of metal. It's got this
Mhm.
really deep, fuzzy,
Yeah.
bluesy riff. I think it was, influenced with the blues that was happening in Britain at the moment at that particular time. But yeah, that's kind of the prototype for metal.
Mhm.
Just so much. It's a potpourri of all these musical styles. It's such a wonderful album. And I think it's
And as far as something is concerned, I wanted to mention this. We've had a discussion. I don't remember what show I was on. We were talking about this, and it's really a big deal when a rock and basically something is basically a standard. I mean, Frank Sinatra liked it. People sang something in Holiday Inn lounges. Kind of like how Billy Joel has New York State of Mind. The Beatles have something, and it's a George song. So there you go.
yeah, I'm sure Elvis had it in his repertoire. I'm sure the viewers will
Sure.
correct
Yeah.
me.
And I love the fact George used to love to tell the story about Frank Sinatra. Because Frank Sinatra used to say that something was the greatest Lennon-McCartney song. And George
Poor
used to
George.
just love telling that story. So,
Got no words after that. All right, I think it's no surprise, but my number one is Sergeant Pepper. It's probably my favorite album of all time. This is album as art. I used to pore over the artwork, look at the lyric sheet. I think it was the first lyrics printed on the back of an album, folded out, just seeing the Beatles in their uniforms or the regalia. I just love this album so much. And I'm not sort of being a copycat here, Bicyclelegs, but Within You or Without You is probably my favorite song of the album. I love it. I just love the orchestral arrangements with that Indian mysticism, those chordal changes. I just think it's such a great side two opener. A Day in the Life, it's magnificent. It's kind of proggy. The changing arrangements, the melodies, and even that final chord at the end where, there's silence and then this final piano chord and you hear the chord just dissipate into the distance. It's just like, I'm making a statement here. I love it. With a little help from my friends, getting better, fixing a hole. It's the Beatles at their absolute stone cold peak. I love everything about this album. But there are folks that don't like it. A lot of folks that like the Beatles in their beat period and that early thing, they don't like this. But to me, this is Beatles to me. And I think it changed the shape of music. And you're right, Bicyclelegs, Pet Sounds. Paul McCartney, he said, when I heard that, I had to roll up the sleeves and I don't know, try harder, but I think it certainly inspired this album.
Mm. Yeah.
So there you have it. We've done our 10. Maybe we could just throw a couple of names without going into too much detail of some albums that were on the bubbling under that would have, if we did a top 20, would have got a bit of a shout out. Bicyclelegs, do you want to just give us 2 or 3?
I'll just mention 3, one of which I've already mentioned, which is Band on the Run. That would have been my number 11, no doubt about it. 2 Beatles albums I would have liked to have included, but I just didn't have the room. I am a fan of that early Beat period Beatles, so I would have loved to have included Please Please Me, and I would have loved to have included A Hard Day's Night, because I think those are both stunningly good Beat albums. So, yeah, those are 3 that I like to throw into the mix.
Todd, 3 or 4?
Yeah, I would have liked to have been able to put A Hard Day's Night on there too. I almost did. It was almost number 10. I'm also fond of Mind Games, and I like I was saying before. I think Pipes of Peace is way underrated, and I also like Tug of War. And I forgot to show this when I did Band on the Run. If anybody is interested in getting a really good vinyl copy of this, get one of these now while they're still available. They're not very expensive, and boy, oh boy, is this good.
Nice. Well, a couple of ones I would have spoken about in the top 20. I would have done Flowers in the Dirt. I really love that collaboration between McCartney and Elvis Costello. And the thing I like about that, Elvis Costello has that little bit of tart John Lennon-ness. I'm just made that word up, but just he's like a great counterpoint to Paul McCartney. So I really like that. Ringo, I think Ringo's got to get a shout. That's like an all-star cast on that album. Help.
I like that album too.
Help. Ram and Mind Games. I think that is probably one of my favorite John Lennon albums, say up to 1975. So there you have it. What a epic show, but we got it done, and we picked our 10 favorite Beatles and Beatles solo albums. And remember, we're not saying it's the best, we're saying it's our favorite. So
our favorite.
All of it is probably just an emotional attachment to our journey through popular music. So please like and subscribe to Bicyclelegs if you haven't already. Plenty of shows, plenty of content every Saturday night. I'll say Australian Standard Time at about 10 p.m. There's always a show weekly. Mr. Todd Evans, you can see him on the Contrarians, Grant's, Rock Warehaus, a whole plethora of shows. You just put in the words Todd Evans and you'll see so many shows, but they're all worth. He's one of our favourite guests. We always love having him on this show.
Thank you.
Wherever good music content can be found, there also can be found Todd.
Yeah, he just follows the good music. And please like and subscribe to Rock Daydream Nation. We cover all genres here. We might be talking about heavy metal. We might be talking about punk rock. We talk about popular music. It's all genres of rock. So good music is good music, no matter what genre it is. So tell us what your favorite Beatles album is. Tell us what your favorite Beatles song is. Whether George was better than, whether you like John, George, Paul, or Ringo. We like reading your comments. But one thing's for sure, you'll see these fine gentlemen on Rock Daydream Nation in 2024. See you soon. Cheers.
Bye.